So at the beginning of the year when we talked about order of operations, I included the absolute value in what we used to call parentheses, but now we are changing to grouping symbols. So a grouping symbol is something that puts things together that says do me first, and the absolute value is one of those symbols. Whenever I write it, I try and write it in red lines and make it obvious that it's an absolute value symbol instead of the number 1. So look for these 2 straight lines on either side of an expression, and it does mean that there is some work to do inside of them. But first I want to talk about negatives and its 3 personalities, I like to call them. The first one is a negative, and you can see that it is attached to that 3 because it is inside its parentheses. So this is attached. And so I would say that is a negative 3. If you look at the next one, though, the negative sign is not attached to it. In other words, it's not inside any kind of grouping symbol. So I would consider that an opposite. And then the last one is how you've always seen it. It's a subtraction. It's between 2 things. When we start working on order of operations, I'm going to encourage you to read your order of operations from left to right before you start. It's like if you were baking or putting together a piece of furniture, you need to make sure all the parts are there and that you understand what's coming up in the next step. And so reading through your order of operations definitely helps with that. So if I were to read this statement here at the bottom, I would say the opposite of 3 squared because that is not inside parentheses, minus 3 because it is between 2 things, plus negative 3 because it is inside parentheses. So you can see that negative symbol had all 3 personalities, opposite, negative, and subtraction. So let's just look at how a couple of these things work. So this first one is not included inside the parentheses. So I would read this and say the opposite of 2 squared. Well, 2 squared is 4, and the opposite of that would be negative 4. The next one, the negative 2 is captured inside the parentheses. So I would consider this negative 2, and I'm just going to abbreviate, squared. Well, negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. So you can see those 2 different things that kind of look similar give completely different answers. The next thing has both inside and outside. So reading left to right, I would say this is opposite, because that's the one on the outside, of negative 2, because that's the one on the inside, and it is squared. So negative 2 squared, we looked up here and we did that earlier, was 4, but now I'm going to take the opposite of that. So that is actually a negative 4. And then down here we have the opposite of negative 4. Because that first one is outside the parentheses, that is an opposite. The one inside the parentheses is a negative. So I have the opposite of negative 4. Well, what is the opposite of negative 4? That would be a positive 4. We're going to be using these more tomorrow, or in adding and subtracting in order of operations. So let's move on to absolute value. I want you to think about this for a minute. You have 2 cars starting off for a race. They're both at the start line. One is facing forward, the other is facing backwards, and they take off at the same time. The one going backwards reaches a speed of 40 miles an hour. So we'll just consider that a negative 40 because it is going backwards. And the other one that's facing forward reaches a speed of 20 miles an hour. Which one is actually going faster? Well, it doesn't matter that that car is going backwards. It is far in the lead over the one going forward at 20 miles an hour. So when you talk about an absolute value, you are looking at the pure value of the number. Not that it's a negative or not that it's a positive, but just the pure value of it. So 40 is clearly more valuable or has a higher value than 20, even though that car is facing backwards. So when we look at that, like here's your starting line. The car that's going forward is going 20 miles an hour, but this car that's going backwards is going 40 miles an hour. So the car that's going 20 has a positive value of 20, if you're looking at pure value of the number, but also the one that's facing backwards also has a pure value of positive 40 because it is going 40 miles an hour. So when you talk about absolute values, it is a distance that a number is from zero. It doesn't matter that it's going negative or going positive. It's just the pure value of how many spaces it is away from zero. So absolute value is a distance. And because it's a distance, it's always going to be positive because you never talk about going negative when you're going to visit somebody. Let's say you're going to visit your grandparents in Florida. Well, Florida is south of us, but you wouldn't say I'm going negative 700 miles to visit my grandparents just because it's south. You're going 700 miles. So absolute value is a distance a number is from zero on the number line. So let's just look at them if I do this. I'm just going to draw a couple absolute value signs. We have positive 4 and we have negative 4. Well, positive 4 is 4 spaces away from 0, but so is negative 4. So they each have the same pure value of being a 4. So you notice both of those are positive numbers. So if I did something like, let's change to red. So if I did something like this, what's the absolute value of negative 7? Well, how far away from 0 is negative 7? It is 7 spaces. Notice that these negative signs are inside the grouping symbols, which makes that a negative 7 and a negative 4. Let me just change it up here a little bit. We're going to go back to this one down here. So this is the absolute value of 7. It is 7 spaces away, and the negative is inside the grouping symbols, so that is a negative 7. What if I put one on the outside? This one on the outside has that definition of opposite because it is outside the grouping symbols. So this is an opposite sign. So if I were to read this, I would say the opposite of the absolute value of negative 7. Well, I know that absolute value of negative 7 is 7, and now I'm just going to take the opposite of it. So this answer is actually a negative 7, not because the absolute value number inside is a negative 7, but because this is asking for the opposite of whatever the absolute value happens to be. So you can get negative numbers, but it's because of what's on the outside of the absolute value sign, not what's on the inside. So that brings us to this slide. So taking away the opposites on the outside, if I look at each one of these, they all have an absolute value of positive 6. These last two are going to be negative 6s, though, because of this opposite sign on the outside. Not because it's a negative on the inside or a positive on the inside, but because we are looking for the opposite of the absolute value, whatever that happens to be. So sometimes you will have a negative answer, but again, it's because of what's on the outside, not on the inside. You can do a couple of these if you'd like to. This first one, and I'll make it a little bigger. This first one, I would read that as the absolute value of negative 9. Well, how many spaces is 9 from 0? It is 9. Here, though, the second one says this is opposite here on the outside. So I'm going to find the absolute value of 35, which is 35, but then I'm going to take the opposite of it. So that answer is actually a negative 35. So it is possible to have a negative answer, but again, because of what's on the outside, not what's on the inside. So let's do these least to greatest. I've got the opposite of the absolute value of 8. I have the absolute value of negative 8. I have the absolute value of negative 5. I have the opposite of the absolute value of 3. The absolute value of negative 7. And then the opposite of the absolute value of negative 7. So let's go ahead and evaluate these because these are expressions and do need to have some work done to them. So this first one, the absolute value of 8 is 8, but then I'm going to take the opposite. The next one is the absolute value of negative 8. Well, that's an 8 because it's 8 spaces away from 0. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. The opposite of the absolute value of 3, well, the absolute value of 3 is 3, and then I'm going to take the opposite. The absolute value of negative 7, well, that's 7. And then I have the opposite of the absolute value of negative 10. Well, the absolute value of negative 10 is 10, and then I'm going to take the opposite. And now I want to list them from least to greatest. Remember, the larger the negative number, the smaller it is. And I would ask you please to put them back in their original order. So if I'm looking at these negatives, I have 3 of them. The largest is going to be the smallest. So this one is my smallest. I'm going to put it back in its original form. The next would be this opposite of the absolute value of 8. And then the opposite of the absolute value of 3. So that takes care of my negatives. So I have 5, 7, and 8. Well, 5 is the smallest. So the absolute value of negative 5. The absolute value of negative 7. And then the absolute value of negative 8. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please reach out. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks. Have a great night.